The city of Beirut had survived so much. It had survived a brutal civil war that tore Lebanon apart for 15 years. It had survived the catastrophic port explosion of 2020 that flattened entire neighborhoods and killed over 200 people in a single instant. It had survived Israeli airstrikes, Syrian interference, political collapse, economic ruin, and the kind of slow institutional decay that grinds a city into dust one corrupt decision at a time. The people of Beirut were not strangers to catastrophe. They had rebuilt before, they had buried their dead, mourned their losses, and returned to the streets with coffee in hand, determined to live again. But nothing. Not the weight of history, not the scars of memory, not the darkest warnings of the most pessimistic analysts could have prepared the Lebanese capital for what descended upon it in the early hours of June 5th, 2026. At precisely 2:17 in the morning, the first American Tomahawk cruise missile struck the southern suburb of Dahiyeh, the dense urban stronghold long considered the nerve center of Hezbollah's command and control infrastructure. The explosion was so massive that residents as far north as Tripoli reported feeling the tremors beneath their feet. Windows shattered across a 3-kilometer radius. The fireball that rose above the rooftops was visible from Cyprus, 60 miles across the Mediterranean Sea. It was not a single strike. It was the opening note of a symphony of destruction. Within the following 90 minutes, United States naval vessels operating from 3 separate carrier strike groups in the eastern Mediterranean, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the USS Nimitz, and the USS Theodore Roosevelt, unleashed a coordinated barrage that military analysts would later describe as the most concentrated aerial bombardment in the history of the modern Middle East. Over 300 individual strike packages were executed before dawn. Tomahawk missiles, joint direct attack munitions, and bunker-busting GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators rained down on pre-selected coordinates across Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, and southern Lebanon with terrifying precision. The targets were not random. The Pentagon had spent 18 months building the most comprehensive targeting package ever assembled against a non-state armed organization. Command bunkers buried 40 meters underground beneath residential apartment blocks in Dahiyeh were hit with sequential penetrator strikes designed to collapse the deepest hardened shelters. Weapons depots disguised as warehouses in the industrial zones south of the airport were incinerated where they stood. Communications relay stations hidden in the basements of hospitals and schools were surgically excised from the urban fabric with the cold efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. But war, even the most precise war, does not stay within the lines drawn on targeting maps. By 4 a.m., the death toll in Dahiyeh alone was estimated at over 3,000 people. By dawn, that number had climbed past 7,000. Rescue workers, those few who had survived and those brave enough to enter the destruction, clawed through mountains of rubble with their bare hands, screaming for voices that would not answer. The civil defense teams, already stretched to breaking point by years of underfunding and political dysfunction, were overwhelmed within the first hour. The Lebanese army, constitutionally barred from confronting the Americans, directly and militarily outmatched in any scenario where they chose otherwise, stood on the perimeter of the destruction and did nothing because there was nothing they could do. The ancient neighborhood of Gitawi, far from any Hezbollah infrastructure, took 2 stray missile impacts that reduced 3 apartment buildings to cascading walls of concrete. A maternity hospital in the Burj Hamid district lost its upper 2 floors to the blast wave of a nearby strike. A convoy of ambulances trying to reach the wounded in Dahiyeh was caught in a secondary explosion from a munitions cache that had cooked off underground, and all 12 vehicles were destroyed in an instant of terrible orange light. By sunrise on June 5th, Beirut was no longer the city it had been the night before. Smoke columns rose in every direction from the southern half of the capital, merging into a single black sky that blocked the morning sun and turned noon into a false twilight. The smell of burning, metal, concrete, flesh, and the particular acrid chemical signature of high explosives drifted north across the city center, across the rebuilt downtown with its glass towers and luxury hotels, across the old port district still scarred from 2020, and out over the blue waters of the Mediterranean where it dispersed into nothing. But Hezbollah was not finished, not even close. The Iron Storm from the north. Hassan Nasrallah was dead. He had been killed in an Israeli airstrike in September 2024, a strike that had also eliminated most of Hezbollah's senior command structure in a single underground conference room. The organization had reeled, restructured, mourned in silence, and rebuilt in darkness. What emerged from that rebuilding was something more dangerous than what had existed before. Leaner, more decentralized, more ideologically hardened, and bristling with the accumulated weapons stockpile of 20 years of Iranian resupply. The new leadership had learned the lesson of Nasrallah's death with brutal clarity. There would be no more central command bunkers. There would be no more leadership conferences with half the organization present. The new Hezbollah operated in cellular networks, in distributed nodes, in units that could receive their launch orders through encrypted satellite bursts and act independently without waiting for authorization from above. It was an organization that had been specifically redesigned to survive the decapitation strike that had killed its founder and continue fighting. At 3:45 a.m., as the American bombardment of Beirut was still in full fury, Hezbollah's northern launch units received their activation signal. From prepared positions across a 100-kilometer front line, stretching from the Lebanese village of Nahariya on the coast to the Syrian border town of Hezbollah in the east, the earth itself appeared to crack open. Launch tubes sunk into reinforced concrete bunkers beneath orchards and farmhouses and olive groves erupted simultaneously. The light show was visible from the Israeli side of the border for a full 4 seconds, before the rockets crossed into Israeli airspace, 4 seconds of staccato orange flashes running like a burning fuse along the horizon. 3,214 rockets were in the air within the first 11 minutes. The Iron Dome batteries positioned across northern Israel, supplemented after October 7th by David's sling platforms and an emergency deployment of American-supplied shore-ed systems, went to full automatic engagement immediately. The intercept rate for incoming rockets was, by any historical measure, extraordinary. The multi-layered air defense system destroyed over 2,000 of the incoming projectiles before they could reach populated areas. Radar operators at the Joint Israeli-American Air Defense Command Center near Haifa watched their screens fill with intercept confirmations and fought to stay focused on the dozens of missiles that were not being intercepted. Because 3,000 rockets, even at a 65% intercept rate, still means over 1,000 impacts. Nahariya was hit first. The coastal city, 20 kilometers from the Lebanese border, received 47 rocket impacts in the space of 8 minutes. The city's central market, a long pedestrian boulevard lined with shops and restaurants, took a direct strike at 3:52 a.m. that collapsed both sides of the street simultaneously. The old hospital at the edge of the city sustained 4 impacts. A residential tower in the northern neighborhood was struck by a Hezbollah Falak II heavy rocket, an Iranian-supplied weapon with a 300-kilogram warhead. And the entire north face of the building came away in a single, slow cascade of floors and balconies and the remnants of people's lives. Haifa was next. The largest city in northern Israel and the country's main industrial and port hub, Haifa had believed itself somewhat protected by distance and the depth of the Iron Dome coverage to its south. It was not protected enough. 11 rockets penetrated the defensive umbrella. The oil refineries on the southern edge of the bay took 2 direct hits and ignited in a fireball that would burn for 6 days. The port facilities were struck. A residential neighborhood in the hotter district on the slopes of Mount Carmel was hit by 3 rockets in rapid succession, killing 41 people and injuring over 200. The famous Baha'i gardens on the upper slopes of the mountain, one of the most beautiful places in the entire Middle East, were cratered by 2 off-course missiles that had been aimed at the industrial zone below. Safed, Acre, Carmiel. Kiryat Shmona, which had been partially evacuated since October 2023 and whose remaining residents had developed the reflexive calm of people who had lived too long under threat, was struck by over 100 rockets in a sustained barrage that left almost nothing standing in its western neighborhoods. Tiberias, on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, received its first rocket impact since the 1973 war. The launch continued in waves. Just as Israeli air assets and American strike aircraft began targeting the identified launch positions in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah activated its second echelon of launchers, positions that had been prepared years earlier and never previously used, preserved specifically for this moment. New launch signatures bloomed on the radar screens. The second wave was smaller but contained a higher proportion of the organization's most advanced weapons. The Fateh 110 precision-guided missiles, the Rod 500 with its modified maneuvering reentry vehicle, and a small number of what intelligence analysts had long feared and long warned about: cruise missiles. Slow, low-flying, terrain-following cruise missiles that the radar systems were not optimized to detect, and the intercept batteries found immensely more difficult to engage. One of these cruise missiles struck the Iron Dome battery outside Kiryat Ada at 4:31 a.m., destroying the launcher and killing the 12-person crew instantly. Another struck the Joint Logistics Facility at Ramat David Air Base, causing significant damage to the runway and destroying 4 F-35I fighters on the ground. A third was intercepted 400 meters above the city of Hadera by a Patriot missile battery that had been redeployed north after the war, with Iran began escalating. A Patriot battery that would not have been there 6 months ago, and whose presence in that exact position had been quietly requested by the Israeli Defense Ministry after American intelligence shared new assessments of Hezbollah's cruise missile inventory. The war had arrived in the north, and it was only getting started. Part 3, Trump speaks. At 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, which was noon in Lebanon and Israel, President Donald Trump appeared in the White House briefing room without a prepared statement. He stood at the podium for a moment in silence, looking directly into the cameras with a particular expression that his supporters described as strength, and his detractors described as barely contained rage. "Last night," he said without preamble, "the United States military executed a series of precision strikes against Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure in Lebanon. We destroyed their command centers. We destroyed their weapons factories. We destroyed their missile stockpiles. We did what needed to be done, and we did it better than anyone else in the world could have done it. He paused and gripped the edges of the podium. In response, these animals, and I'm going to call them what they are, animals, launched 3,000 rockets into the cities of Israel. They hit hospitals. They hit homes. They hit families. They murdered children in their beds. And Iran, the regime in Tehran that funds these killers, that built these missiles, that pointed them at innocent people, Iran is responsible. The room was absolutely silent. I have authorized the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs to expand our operational parameters. We are going to finish this. We are going to finish this completely and finally, and in a way that guarantees it never happens again. To the people of Iran, the real people, the people who want freedom and a future, we are not your enemy. We never were. But your government made a choice, and choices have consequences. He turned and walked away from the podium without taking questions. Within an hour, the social media landscape had fractured along its now permanent fault lines. Half the world called it a declaration of escalation toward regional war. The other half called it the most powerful statement of American strength in a generation. Oil futures spiked $40 in 20 minutes. Gold hit a record high. The Dow Jones lost 900 points before the opening bell. In Tehran, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei did not respond publicly. He did not need to. The instructions had already been sent. Part 4. The Widening Circle. By midday on June 5th, the war had acquired a momentum that no single government or military could fully control. In Baghdad, rocket attacks on the U.S. Embassy compound in the Green Zone, attacks carried out by Iran-backed militia groups operating under the umbrella of the Popular Mobilization Forces, killed 9 American security contractors and wounded 31 others. The embassy was not evacuated. Ambassador Patricia Cordell, a veteran diplomat with 30 years of experience in the region, issued a statement from within the compound that was careful and measured and made clear that the United States did not intend to abandon its mission in Iraq, regardless of the security situation. 3 hours later, American B-52 bombers, operating from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, struck militia staging areas in the desert west of Baghdad, killing an estimated 200 fighters. In Syria, where Hezbollah had maintained weapons transfer corridors and logistics infrastructure since the early years of the Civil War, American and Israeli aircraft struck simultaneously at a series of targets in the Qalamun region northeast of Damascus. The Syrian air defense system, substantially degraded by a decade of Israeli mowing the grass operations, and never fully restored, offered only token resistance. Several Russian-made Panzer S-1 batteries attempted engagements and were themselves immediately targeted and destroyed. In Yemen, the Houthi movement, which had spent the previous 2 years conducting a persistent campaign of drone and missile attacks against Red Sea shipping and against Saudi Arabia, launched a new barrage of ballistic missiles aimed at the Israeli port city of Eilat. 3 were intercepted by the Aero Missile Defense System. 1 was not. It struck the hotel and commercial district on the northern edge of the city at 2:15 p.m. local time, killing 67 people and collapsing 2 hotels into a pile of glass and steel and dust. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil passed every day, was now considered operationally threatened. 3 commercial tankers had been turned back by Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval vessels in the past 6 hours. Lloyd's of London suspended insurance coverage for new transits through the strait, effective immediately. The price of Brent crude oil hit $147 a barrel, a figure not seen since the speculative peak of 2008. In Washington, the National Security Council convened for the 3rd time in 18 hours. Defense Secretary William Hagerty briefed the president on a proposed expansion of strike operations into Iranian territory proper. Not the nuclear sites, not yet, but the IRGC naval installations at Bandar Abbas and the missile manufacturing complex outside Kojir, east of Tehran. The CIA director presented signals intelligence indicating that Iran was moving mobile ballistic missile launchers to pre-surveilled firing positions from which they could reach American bases across the region. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Michael Langford, spoke last. He had served in 3 wars, commanded forces across 4 theaters, and had the particular stillness of a man who had thought more deeply and more honestly about violence than almost anyone else in the room. "Mr. President," he said, "we are at a decision point. Once we strike inside Iran's borders at targets of this scale, we are in a different kind of war than we have been conducting up to this point. I want to make sure everyone in this room understands that distinction clearly and accepts its implications before we proceed." Part 5. Beirut by night. A city trying to breathe. As the strategic decisions cascaded through command structures and down through chains of authority to the operators who would carry them out on the ground in Beirut, the work of surviving continued. Dr. Rima Khalil had been on duty at the American University of Beirut Medical Center since the first explosions woke the entire hospital staff at 2:17 a.m. She was an emergency physician, 38 years old, born in Beirut, trained in Paris, returned home because she had genuinely believed, with the particular optimism of someone who has seen other places and chosen this one anyway, that the worst was behind her city. She had now been on her feet for 15 straight hours. The emergency department had received over 400 patients since the strikes began. They had run out of blood type O negative before dawn. They had run out of morphine by 8 a.m. They were operating on a generator that the chief of maintenance warned her, with the measured terror of a man trying not to alarm anyone, might not last through the night. She worked on a 12-year-old boy from Dahiyeh whose legs had been destroyed by shrapnel and whose name she did not know because he had arrived unconscious and alone, without family, without documents, without any marker of identity, except the particular haircut that told her he had been heading into adolescence before this night took that future from him. She focused on what she could control. She made decisions in the space of seconds. She moved to the next patient. Outside, in the parking lot that had become a triage area, and then a secondary treatment space, and then a place where those who were beyond treatment were moved so that those who might survive could have the space and the hands and the remaining supplies dedicated to them, her colleague, Dr. Faisal Musawi, walked among the injured and the dying with a calmness that was not detachment but something harder and more costly. The calmness of a man who had made a decision, somewhere in the previous hours, to feel everything later and survive the present moment first. He had treated over 60 patients himself. He had pronounced 31 dead. He had spoken to 6 families and told them things that could not be unsaid. His own apartment, in the southern suburbs 3 kilometers away, he had not been able to reach by phone since the second wave of strikes at 4 a.m. His wife, Lena, and their 2 daughters, aged 6 and 9, had been there when the war began. He did not know if they were still there. He did not know if they were still alive. He worked. He continued working. Because stopping was not an option he could afford to consider. The international media had arrived in force by mid-morning. Satellite trucks, correspondents in body armor, the whole mechanized apparatus of global attention that descended on catastrophe with professional speed. Their cameras captured the smoke and the rubble and the weeping families and the exhausted rescue workers and transmitted them to every screen on Earth. The images were devastating and immediate, and they changed nothing about what was happening on the ground. By nightfall on June 5th, the estimated death toll in Lebanon had passed 12,000. The number was provisional, and the reality was certainly worse, because there were areas of Dahiyeh where the destruction was so complete and so total that counting required first clearing rubble that would take weeks to move, and the people underneath it were beyond counting in any meaningful near-term sense. In northern Israel, the confirmed death toll from the rocket attacks stood at 412. Thousands more were wounded. Over 1 million people in the north had either fled south or descended into bomb shelters and had not emerged. The cities of Haifa, Nahariya, Acre, and Tiberias were under continuous alert. Schools were closed across the entire country. Ben Gurion Airport was operating at 15% capacity, with most international carriers having suspended service. Part 6. What the world said. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session at noon New York time and immediately collapsed into procedural chaos, which was the Security Council's particular specialty in moments of genuine crisis. Russia called for an immediate ceasefire resolution. The United States vetoed it. China abstained on procedural grounds and delivered a lengthy statement calling for restraint from all parties, while simultaneously moving 3 naval vessels into the Gulf of Oman, in what Beijing described as a routine exercise and what the Pentagon described as something rather different. France called for an emergency G7 summit. Germany expressed deep concern. The United Kingdom, whose special relationship with the United States placed it in the uncomfortable position of being bound by alliance to a war it had not been consulted on, issued a statement that was masterwork of diplomatic language, carefully supportive without committing any actual support, appropriately alarmed without naming who or what it was alarmed by. The Arab League met an emergency session in Cairo and released a communique calling for the protection of Lebanese civilian lives and the immediate cessation of hostilities, a statement that was noted and ignored by every party to the conflict simultaneously. Turkey's President Erdogan gave a televised address calling American actions a war crime and calling on the Islamic world to respond with all available means, a phrase that his government subsequently spent 3 days clarifying did not mean what it sounded like it meant. On social media, the war was the only subject. Every phone on Earth that was connected to a network was carrying images and videos from Beirut and northern Israel in real time. The rocket launches, captured on dash cams and security cameras, and the phones of terrified civilians were among the most widely viewed video footage in internet history. A video of a family in Kiryat Shmona, sheltering in a basement while the building above them came apart, was watched 400 million times in 36 hours. A video shot by a Lebanese civil defense worker in Dahiyeh, who walked for 7 minutes through a landscape of total annihilation without speaking a single word, was viewed over 1 billion times and became the defining image of the conflict the way that certain photographs had defined the wars of previous generations. Epilogue. Dispatches from the edge. Somewhere on the Lebanese coast, north of the city, a fisherman named Georges Frem had taken his boat out at first light as he had done every morning for 40 years. He had heard the bombardment throughout the night from his house on the hill above the harbor. He had held his wife and listened and waited for the silence that eventually came, and then went out to work because the sea did not care about wars, and the fish did not stop moving because men were killing each other on the shore. He sat in his small boat in the morning light with the smoke of Beirut rising on the southern horizon behind him, and cast his net into water that was calm and blue and indifferent to human catastrophe. He thought about his son, who lived in Dahiyeh and who had not answered his phone. He thought about what it meant to be 71 years old and to have lived through the Civil War and the Israeli occupation and the 2006 war and the 2020 explosion and now this. He thought about whether there was a version of the future in which his grandson, who was 4 years old and loved trucks and the color red, would grow up in a Lebanon that was finally allowed to simply exist. He did not catch much that morning. The fish were deep and far out, as if they too had decided to put distance between themselves and the shore. He sat in the boat for a long time after pulling in the empty net, and looked at the smoke and the water and the sky and said nothing to anyone, because there was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. In the city behind him, the second night of the war was ending and the second dawn was coming, and no one on either side of any border could say with confidence what it would bring. The war had come to Beirut again, and Beirut, broken and bleeding and burning as it was still there, still breathing, still, against every reasonable expectation, refusing to simply be finished,